Vico Valenti had killed men for less than what this woman had done. He didn't know her name, didn't know where she'd come from, and couldn't remember how he'd gotten here. But when he opened his eyes in the one place on earth nobody was supposed to know about, she was standing in his kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, wearing his shirt, his white cotton shirt, hanging off her bony shoulders like a dress she'd stolen from someone else's life. She wasn't beautiful. Not in the way the women in his world were beautiful. She was thin in the way people got thin when they hadn't eaten a real meal in days. Her collarbones sharp enough to cut glass, a fading bruise along her jawline that she hadn't bothered to explain. There was blood on his kitchen floor, most of it his, and the wound in his side had been stitched shut with a steady hand he didn't recognize. She was a delivery driver, 27, living out of a rusted Honda Civic for the past 8 months. He was the man who'd controlled half of Chicago's underworld for a decade, and somehow, she'd found him on the worst night of his life, dragged him out of the cold, and saved him for reasons she couldn't quite explain herself. But it wasn't the stitches that undid him. It wasn't waking up to a stranger in his safe house, or the fact that she'd gone through his things without flinching at what she found. It was what she did next. She cooked for him. A $2 plate of pasta from the only jar of sauce he'd kept in that cabinet for 3 years and never once opened. And when Vico Valenti, the man no one in Chicago dared look in the eye, took the first bite, something inside him shattered in a way that no bullet and no betrayal ever could. He didn't make a sound. The tears just fell. And the girl in his shirt didn't say a word. Because somehow, she understood exactly what that meant. This is the story of the most dangerous man in Chicago, and the homeless girl who brought him to his knees with nothing but a plate of pasta and a kindness he didn't deserve. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who needs a story that'll keep them up tonight, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the night Leah Sutton found a dying man on the side of the road and made the worst decision of her life. 6 hours before Leah Sutton dragged a dying man into the back seat of her car, she was trying to keep her fingers from going numb on the steering wheel. The 2009 Honda Civic shuddered in the wind. The heater had been dead since October, and she didn't have $70 to fix it. Her hands were cracked raw, the tips of both index fingers wrapped in cheap bandages bought at a dollar store, the kind so thin they peeled off after 2 hours of driving, but they were still better than letting bare skin touch a steering wheel as cold as iron. She wore 3 layers, a t-shirt underneath, a hoodie in the middle, and a fake leather jacket she'd bought at Goodwill for $4, too wide for her body, the sleeves falling over her wrists, but warmer than nothing. The back seat of the Civic held everything she owned in the world: a black trash bag full of clothes, a plastic box of toiletries, and an old tin box with $47 in cash tips inside. Money she'd saved 1 bill at a time over the past 2 weeks and didn't dare touch unless she truly had to. She had just finished her last delivery of the day, Thai food for an apartment on the south side, where the man opened the door, took the bag without looking at her, without saying thank you, without tipping. She closed the app and looked at the number on the screen, $38.50 after 9 hours of driving. She did the math in her head the way she always did. Subtract $14 for gas, subtract $3.20 for car insurance divided by the day, leaving $21.30. Not enough for both a meal and a safe place to park overnight, and she'd made that choice a long time ago. Free parking and no dinner, because sleeping in the car somewhere bright with cameras cost money, while sleeping somewhere dark without cameras cost sleep. She drove back to the lot behind a closed Walgreens on the west side, where she'd slept nearly 20 nights over the past month. The security camera had been broken since summer. The guard didn't patrol, and if she parked close to the back wall, no one from the main road could see her. She turned off the engine, pulled the thin blanket from the back seat over herself, then reached into the pocket of her hoodie and took out a packet of crackers, the small kind people served with bowls of soup at diners, 3 packets she'd picked up from a restaurant the week before when she came to collect an order. That was dinner. She ate slowly, 1 small bite at a time, because she'd learned that eating slowly made the stomach think it was getting more than it really was. In the cup holder, wedged between a water bottle and a roll of napkins, was a thick book with a faded cover, a broken spine, and pages crowded with pencil notes. Fundamentals of Nursing Practice, the book she'd bought 6 years ago, when she finally managed to enroll as a second-year nursing student at City Colleges of Chicago. The years she spent grinding through her studies were the years she believed life would turn out differently, that she would have a profession, a paycheck, a home, health insurance, and a refrigerator with food inside it. Then her father died. Not suddenly, but slowly, the way alcohol kills a person. A little more each day, until his liver couldn't bear it anymore. The burial money took all the tuition money. There was no one left to share the rent. She dropped out, did everything she could, waited tables, worked a register, cleaned hotel rooms, until she lost her last job 8 months ago and couldn't pay the rent on the tiny studio she'd been living in. Since then, the Civic had been home. She didn't sell the nursing book because it wasn't worth much, but in truth, she knew the real reason. She didn't sell it because she wasn't ready to admit that dream was dead. She pulled the hood over her eyes, locked the car doors by hand from the inside, folded her legs up on the driver's seat, and pressed her back against the door. Outside, the December wind in Chicago cut through the gap in the window glass, the kind of cold that didn't merely chill the skin but settled into the bones, the kind that woke her at 3 o'clock every morning and left her lying there trembling until daylight came, enough for her to drive off in search of a place with a public bathroom. She closed her eyes, not praying, because she'd given up that habit long ago, only holding on to a vague hope that tomorrow would bring more orders, better tips, or at least nothing worse than today. She didn't know that in less than an hour, she would see blood on the snow, and her life would never be the same again. She couldn't sleep. The cold wouldn't let her sleep. That cold piercing through the thin blanket, through 3 layers of clothing, straight into her spine, holding her awake with a merciless grip. Leah lay curled on the driver's seat for nearly 40 minutes before she gave up and started the engine again, because at least the sound of the motor made her feel as though she still had control over something. She decided to drive around for a while, not going anywhere, just driving so the engine would run, and whatever little warmth remained in the ventilation system could leak out just enough to stop her from shaking. The road she chose cut through the abandoned industrial district on the west side, where at night there was nothing but closed warehouses, rusted chain-link fences, and streetlights flickering in a dull yellow haze. The snow had started falling harder. Not the soft, pretty kind of snow people saw in movies, but wet, heavy snow that clung to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. She drove slowly, leaning forward, squinting through the white blur as her headlights swept across the curb. And then she saw it, a human shape lying face down on the sidewalk, the upper half on the curb, the lower half sliding down into the drainage gutter. Around that body, the white snow was stained with a dark red smear, spreading slowly like someone had poured wine across a tablecloth. Leah hit the brakes, and the car slid lightly on the wet road before stopping. Her heart slammed hard. Her first instinct told her to drive away. Drive away right now. This wasn't her problem. She didn't have health insurance, didn't have a fixed address. Calling 911 meant the police would come. The police would ask where she lived, why she was here at this hour, what papers she had, and every one of those questions was a rope that could drag her into trouble. She didn't have the money or the strength to escape, but the second instinct was stronger, and that instinct didn't speak in the voice of bravery. It spoke in the voice of her second-year professor, the woman who had taught her that if a victim was lying face down on a hard surface, the airway could be blocked by the person's own tongue, and that in below-freezing temperatures like tonight, hypothermia could kill a person losing blood within 1 hour or less. Leah swore, shut off the engine, opened the car door, and stepped out. The snow-filled wind slapped her in the face at once, so cold she had to close her eyes for 1 second before bending down. A man, large, broad-shouldered, probably weighing more than 90 kilograms. He was wearing a black suit, with a white dress shirt underneath. But now the stomach and the left side were almost completely soaked crimson. She rolled him onto his side, checked his face, and found heavy bruising on his cheekbone and around his left eye socket. A split lip, dried blood crusted at his hairline. Her hand pulled up the hem of his shirt, and she saw the wound on his left side. Not a knife wound. She knew what knife wounds looked like from books. This was a bullet graze, tearing a long path through skin and muscle but not driving deep inside. Blood was still seeping, slow but steady. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck to find a pulse. Weak, slower than normal, but there. He was alive. Leah should have called 911. She knew that. But her hand had already started searching the pockets of his suit jacket, not out of curiosity, but because she needed to know who this man was before deciding what she had stepped into. In the left breast pocket, her fingers touched cold metal, and she pulled out a 9mm Beretta in a leather holster. She froze. Not because she was afraid of guns. She'd grown up in Chicago, She knew what guns looked like. She froze because she understood immediately, clearly and undeniably, that the man lying in front of her wasn't a robbery victim, wasn't an accident victim, wasn't someone the police would come save and thank her for finding. She set the gun down in the snow beside her knee and kept searching. A black leather wallet, no driver's license, no credit cards, not a single piece of identification. Only cash. She counted fast. More than $3,000, all in $100 bills. In the innermost pocket of his suit jacket, a small piece of paper folded into quarters, handwritten in black ink. Only one line. An address in Riverside. No name, no note. Leah sat back on her heels in the snow, staring at the $3,000 in her left hand and the piece of paper in her right. $3,000 was 3 months of gas, 3 months of food, 3 months without subtracting every last cent after each driving shift. No one knew she was here. No cameras, no witnesses, and the snow would cover the tracks within an hour. She could take the money, get in the car, drive away, and no one in the world would ever know. But then she looked down at his side, at the blood still seeping between her fingers where she had pressed a moment earlier to check the wound, and her professor's voice rose again in her mind, clearer than the wind, saying that this rate of blood loss combined with the outside temperature meant this man would die before an ambulance arrived, even if she called right now. Leah swore again, shoved the money and the folded paper back into his jacket pocket, put the gun back into the holster, then slid her arms under his armpits and pulled. 90 kilograms of unconscious human weight on a snow-covered road. She dragged him half a meter before slipping and falling, her knee slamming into the sidewalk. She got up and pulled again. Realizing the back seat was completely blocked by her life's belongings, she frantically grabbed her trash bag of clothes and plastic boxes, tossing them onto the front passenger floorboard. It took her nearly 10 minutes to drag him to the now cleared rear door of the car and shove him into the back seat. His legs stuck out, so she had to fold his knees, force them inside, and then slam the door shut with her whole body. Blood soaked into the seat fabric immediately. She grabbed the old towel, the only thing she used to dry herself in public bathrooms, and pressed it against his side. Then she got into the driver's seat, pulled the folded paper from his suit pocket, and entered the Riverside address into Google Maps with shaking fingers. 22 minutes. She drove. The snow fell thicker, the wipers scraped and groaned, and in the rearview mirror, the unconscious man's face appeared every time she passed under a streetlight. A sharp jaw, dark brows, a faint scar drawn across his temple, like someone had carved a line there with a knife long ago. Even unconscious, blood-soaked, collapsed in the back seat of the cheapest car in the neighborhood, this man looked like something anyone with a survival instinct should stay far away from. And Leah Sutton was driving straight to his home. Google Maps led her off the main road onto a narrow dirt lane she almost missed, because the snow had swallowed the shoulder and the turn sign was hidden behind the trees. The Civic growled as the tires spun and slipped over mud mixed with snow, but she kept steady pressure on the gas and drove nearly 5 more minutes between 2 rows of bare, black trees before the headlights shone straight onto a 2-story wooden house at the end of the road. Her first impression was that the place had been abandoned. Paint peeled away in large patches. The wooden fence out front leaned broken to one side. One corner of the front steps had rotted through, and there wasn't a single light inside. She turned off the engine, sat still for 1 second, stared through the windshield at the pitch-black house, then glanced into the rearview mirror. The man was still unconscious, his head tilted to one side, the towel pressed against his ribs, now almost completely soaked red. She got out, climbed the front steps, and touched the front door handle, locked, but not with an ordinary lock. She looked closer and saw, beneath the peeling paint, a hidden electronic keypad, nearly flat and almost invisible, the kind of lock she'd only seen in advertisements for expensive apartments, not on a house that looked as if it was about to collapse. She didn't have the code. She went around back, snow rising to the middle of her shins, and checked every first-floor window. The bathroom window at the rear wasn't fully locked. The old latch had come loose, and when she pushed upward with both hands, the frame slid open with a creak. She crawled inside, hit her knee against the sink, then felt around in the dark for the light switch. The light came on, and she stood still. The inside of the house was nothing like the outside. Nothing at all. The bathroom was spotless. White tile, towels hanging in a straight line, a large first aid kit arranged neatly on a shelf. She stepped into the hallway, turned on more lights, and saw a house so minimalist it felt almost cold. A black leather sofa sat in the center of the living room, facing a low wooden table with nothing on it. No vase, no books, no magazines, no decorations. White walls, completely bare, not one photograph, not one painting. The wooden floor was so clean she could see her own reflection in it. This wasn't an abandoned house. This was the home of someone who didn't want anyone to know he lived here. She unlocked the front door from the inside, went back out to the car, and began dragging him in. He was heavier than she remembered, or she was more exhausted than she thought. She slid her arms under his armpits, pulled him forward in short sections, rested, then pulled again, sweat breaking out beneath her 3 layers even though the air was freezing, her knee throbbing from the fall on the sidewalk earlier. It took her nearly 15 minutes to drag him through the door, across the hallway, and lay him on the black leather sofa. The sofa was just long enough, but his legs still hung off the end. She stood there panting for a while, then went into the kitchen to find scissors. She cut off the suit jacket first, peeling it away in sections, then the white dress shirt, cutting straight down the center of his chest, from his throat to his stomach, because she couldn't undress him while he was unconscious, and twice her weight. The fabric tore open, and she saw the body underneath. Muscular, unmistakably so, broad shoulders, a thick chest, a flat stomach, but that wasn't what made her stop. Scars, everywhere. One long mark cut diagonally across his left chest, thick and white. A knife wound healed long ago. On his right shoulder was a round dent sunk into the skin, and she recognized it immediately. An old bullet wound, many years healed, the surrounding skin puckered from the scar. And on his left arm, on the inside near the elbow, were small round burn marks, neat and regular, spaced almost evenly apart. She knew what those marks were. Someone had put out cigarettes on his arm, not once, but many times, and the even spacing meant it had been deliberate, not an accident. This wasn't the body of an ordinary man. This was the body of someone who had been tortured and had fought for years, and she was standing in his secret house at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning with a gun in a holster less than half a meter from her hand. Leah took a long breath, then did what she knew how to do. She took the first aid kit from the bathroom, opened the refrigerator to look for antiseptic, but there was none. Only a bottle of Macallan, 18-year-old, the kind of whiskey she knew cost more than $100 because she had once delivered a bottle to a customer, and she used it to rinse the bullet graze on his side because it was the only alcohol in this house. He jerked while still unconscious when the alcohol touched raw flesh, but he didn't wake. She stitched the wound with the needle and thread from the first aid kit, her hands steady even though they had been shaking all this time, because her hands were always steady when she did this, just like back at school, when she had always been the one with the straightest stitches in the practice lab. She checked his pupils, and the light response was normal, with no sign of severe head trauma. She checked for shock, his skin cold, but his pulse had steadied after she stopped the bleeding. She covered him with the only blanket she could find in the upstairs bedroom closet. Then she waited, and while she waited, she explored the house, not out of curiosity, but because she needed to know what kind of person's home she was standing in. Upstairs there was only one bedroom, a large bed, white sheets, white pillows, nothing else. She opened the closet, and inside it was all black. Black suits, black shirts, black pants, black leather shoes, several of each, made from material she only had to touch once, to know it cost more than all the clothes she owned put together. In the drawer of the small nightstand beside the bed, she found a second gun and a small notebook bound in black leather. She opened it, and inside were numbers, symbols, initials, nothing she understood. But it looked like a kind of ledger people didn't want anyone else to read. She put it back. Downstairs in the kitchen, other than the bottle of whiskey, the refrigerator held 3 cans of beans, a box of pasta, a jar of tomato sauce, and nothing else. No milk, no eggs, no vegetables, no fruit, no fresh food. The kitchen cabinets had a few plates, a few glasses, a small set of pots that looked as if they had never been used. This was the kitchen of someone who never cooked. She almost missed it. In the bedroom nightstand drawer, beneath the second gun, caught in the far inside corner, was a photograph. Small. Old. The edges slightly curled. A middle-aged woman with black hair stood in a kitchen, smiling brightly, her hands dusted with flour, surrounded by pots and steam. Her smile wasn't a smile for a camera. It was the smile of someone who was happy, and someone else had caught the exact moment. Leah turned it over. On the back was a handwritten line in ink, round and slightly slanted, in Italian. For my Vico. Mama, 2003. She looked at the photograph longer than she needed to. Then she looked around the house again. The empty refrigerator. The empty walls. Not a trace of life except expensive black clothes and guns, and one single photograph of a woman with flour on her hands, hidden at the bottom of a drawer. Leah Sutton didn't know who Vico Valenti was, but she understood people through their kitchens, and this kitchen told her that the man lying on the sofa downstairs was very rich, very dangerous, very secretive, and utterly, absolutely alone. Vico Valenti didn't wake up. He shot awake. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. A sharp inhale tearing through his lungs, pain flaring in his left side as if someone had pressed a hot iron bar into his skin, and his left hand swept across his chest, reaching for the Beretta by an instinct programmed into him for more than 15 years. The holster was empty. His fingers closed around air, and adrenaline surged in place of clarity. He rolled off the sofa, or more accurately, fell off it, his right shoulder hitting the wooden floor first, then his face, then his knee, and his vision went black for nearly 2 seconds, before the light came back in a blur, as if he were looking through water. He lay on the floor, cheek pressed to the cold wood, breathing hard, and began taking inventory the way a man did when he had woken many times in worse condition than he'd expected. Left side, tightly bandaged, painful, but not the kind of pain that came from deep inside, a shallow wound. Right hand, swollen from wrist to fingers, possibly a cracked metacarpal, still movable, though every finger felt as if it had been struck by electricity when he tried to close his fist. Face, badly bruised, left eye nearly swollen shut, lip split, the taste of dried blood on his tongue. He was alive. That was the only good news. Memory returned in fragments, out of order, like someone had torn up a photograph and thrown each piece into his face. Tommy sitting across from him in the meeting room behind the restaurant on Taylor Street. Tommy's smile wide and easy. Tommy's voice calm, as if he were talking about the weather when he said, "Everything's been arranged, Vico." And Vico hadn't understood then why that sentence chilled the back of his neck for half a second before he brushed it aside. Because Tommy was family. Tommy was the only man he trusted with his life. Then the intersection. 2 black SUVs blocking the front and back of his car at the same time. Precise, coordinated. The kind of ambush that could only happen when someone knew his exact route in advance. Glass breaking. Gunfire. Not one shot but a burst of it. Heavy, hard, metallic pieces flying into his face. Gino in the driver's seat shouted something Vico couldn't hear clearly, then shoved him toward the rear door. Gino's hand covered in blood. Gino's blood. And Vico remembered running through snow and darkness. His hand pressed to his left side where the bullet had just grazed him. His phone lost somewhere, or broken somewhere. He didn't know. He only knew he had run until his legs couldn't run anymore, and snow rushed into his face. Cold, then nothing. He didn't remember how he had gotten to the safe house. This was his safe house. He recognized the ceiling, recognized the black leather sofa he had chosen himself, recognized the smell of wood and the particular silence of the house at the end of the dirt road that only he and Gino knew about. But he hadn't driven himself here. He knew that because he didn't remember it, and Gino had been bleeding at the intersection. So who had brought him here? And who had bandaged his wound? Vico forced himself to crawl up and lean his back against the side of the sofa, his eyes sweeping the room. The blanket on the sofa wasn't the one he usually used. It had a different smell. The smell of a public laundromat. There were bloodstains on the floor that hadn't been fully wiped away, a dragging trail from the front door to the sofa. Someone had dragged him in here. Then he heard it, the soft tap of a pot against the stove. Water running from the faucet, from the kitchen. Someone was in his kitchen. Vico looked around for a weapon. The chest holster was empty, the gun gone. Either someone had taken it out, or it had fallen when he was dragged into the house. His eyes stopped on the base of the table lamp beside the sofa, iron, heavy, nearly half a meter tall. He gripped it with his left hand, tightened his hold, and felt its weight, heavy enough to crush a skull. He stood, slowly, swallowing the pain in his side, and stepped toward the kitchen. His bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor, because he had been trained to move silently since he was 16, when his father taught him that the man who made noise was the man who died first. At the kitchen threshold, he stopped. A girl stood by the stove with her back to him. Thin. Not delicately thin, but thin from hunger. Her ribs faintly visible through the fabric, but her back was straight, her shoulders open, and her hands held the pot with the steadiness of someone used to using her hands for work, not decoration. She was boiling water. In his kitchen, in the house no one in the world was supposed to know about. Vico raised the lamp base to shoulder height, his jaw clenched tight. She turned around, not because she had heard him, but perhaps because she felt the air in the room change, or perhaps because she had known he was standing there from the moment he crossed the threshold. Gray eyes looked straight at him, deeply shadowed, exhausted, but there was no fear in them. She looked at the iron lamp base in his hand, looked down at his ready-to-strike stance, then looked back into his eyes, and said in a voice hoarse from lack of sleep, "If you hit me with that after I spent 3 hours stitching you up, then you're the most ungrateful man I've ever met." Vico didn't lower the lamp base. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" He didn't ask. He ordered, using the voice that, for the past 10 years, made people answer at once or suffer the consequences. The girl didn't answer immediately. She turned back to look at the pot of water on the stove, as if checking whether it had boiled mattered more than answering a man holding an iron lamp base behind her. Then she said, her voice so calm it was almost tired, "First floor bathroom window. Broken lock. You should fix it." She opened the upper kitchen cabinet, took out 2 cups, set them on the counter, then turned to look at him again with unblinking gray eyes. "There's no coffee. Only tea that expired last year. Do you want some?" Vico lowered the lamp, not because she had convinced him, but because his knees were about to give out, and he'd rather die than let this girl see him fall again. He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down heavily, his back against the wall, keeping his face calm, even though his left side hurt so badly that every breath felt as if someone were pressing a finger into the stitches. She set a cup of hot water in front of him. Not tea, because she had thrown the expired tea bag into the trash. Just hot water. Then she sat down in the chair across from him, both hands wrapped around her own cup, and waited. Vico looked at her. He had interrogated people for 15 years, and he knew how to read liars, how they avoided eye contact, or avoided it too, obviously, in order to look as if they weren't avoiding it, how their fingers moved when their mouths said one thing and their minds were thinking another. He began asking questions, his voice cold, even, rhythmic, not the voice of conversation, but the voice of interrogation, the kind he used when he sat in a closed room with someone who owed him money or owed him answers. "Name, Leah Sutton. What do you do?" "Delivery, DoorDash." "Where did you find me?" "An industrial road on the west side, near the abandoned warehouses. You were face down on the curb, half your body in the gutter. Why didn't you call 911? "Because I live in my car, I don't have a fixed address, and I don't need the police asking me 17 questions I don't want to answer." "How did you know this address?" "I went through your jacket pocket. I was looking for identification, but there wasn't any. Just a handwritten note with the Riverside address." She spoke directly, briefly, without adding unnecessary details, without long explanations. Each answer gave exactly enough, then stopped. Vico realized she didn't speak like someone trying to make another person believe her. She spoke like someone who didn't care whether he believed her or not. He kept asking, "What else did you see in my pockets?" Leah looked straight into his eyes. A handgun in a chest holster. More than $3,000 in cash, all $100 bills. No identification, no cards, no phone. She paused for 1 second, then added, "And when I got inside the house, I found another gun in the nightstand drawer, along with a small black leather notebook full of codes I didn't understand." She said all of that without her voice changing at all, as if she were listing items in a delivery order, instead of admitting that she had searched the home of a mafia boss. "I'm not stupid," she said, her finger tapping lightly against the side of her cup. "I know what kind of person hides a gun in his suit and carries $3,000 in cash without so much as a driver's license. I don't need to know who you are. I just need you not to die in the backseat of my car, because I don't have the money to get blood cleaned out of the upholstery." Vico sat still. He looked at her. Not just at her eyes, but at all of her. Her hands around the cup, her shoulders, the way she sat. Her hands weren't hidden under the table, weren't clenched, weren't laced together. Her eyes didn't look away, and didn't try too hard to hold his. She was telling the truth. He knew that not because he trusted her, but because there was no reason for her to lie. If she had wanted to hurt him, she would have let him die in the street. If she had wanted money, she would have taken the $3,000 and driven away. She had done neither. And now she was sitting here drinking hot water in his kitchen, as if this were an ordinary Sunday morning. "You're not afraid of me," Vico said. It wasn't a question. Leah set her cup down and looked at him with gray eyes that were exhausted but fully awake. "I've been sleeping in my car on the south side for 8 months. I've been robbed twice. I had a drunk man smash my car window at 3 o'clock in the morning last month. My former manager kept 3 weeks of my pay, and I couldn't sue because I didn't have money for a lawyer. You're sitting in a kitchen chair in your own house with a wound I stitched and a cup of water I boiled. You're not the scariest thing in my week." Vico looked at her, and for the first time in this strange long night, he felt something that wasn't suspicion, wasn't anger, but something almost like pure surprise, because he was so used to people fearing him that he couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to him without weighing every word first. But surprise didn't change the facts, and the fact was, he was in the worst position he had been in since his father was alive. His phone was broken or lost. He couldn't contact Gino. He didn't know whether Gino was alive or dead. He didn't know who in the organization was still standing with him. He was wounded. His right hand was almost useless, and the stitches in his side would tear open if he moved too hard. And this girl knew the location of the safe house. If she left and told anyone, accidentally or on purpose, he was dead. Not possibly dead, but certainly dead, because Tommy would find him within 1 day. $10,000, Vico said, his voice flat as the table. "You stay for 48 hours. You don't go outside. You don't call anyone. You don't tell anyone about this place. After 48 hours, you leave richer, and you forget I exist." Leah looked at him. She tilted her head slightly to one side, the way a person did when calculating, then said, 20,000, half up front. And for the first time that night, the first time in months if he was honest, the corner of Vico Valenti's mouth lifted slightly. Almost a smile. Only almost. He nodded. The deal was signed with a nod in an empty kitchen in the middle of a winter night, between a fallen boss and a homeless delivery girl, and they both knew that $10,000 up front wasn't anywhere in this house right now. But neither of them mentioned it because they both understood that this agreement wasn't really about money. The hours that followed passed slowly in silence. Vico lay back on the sofa, not sleeping, eyes closed but ears open, tracking every movement she made by sound. And he heard strange things. He heard her open a can of beans, but she only ate half before covering the rest and putting it in the refrigerator. He heard her wash the spoon immediately, the water running for less than 10 seconds, then the sound of the spoon being put back exactly where it belonged. Every few hours, he heard her footsteps approach the sofa. Light, then cold fingers touched his wrist to check his pulse, or pulled the blanket gently up over his shoulder, then moved away without saying anything, without needing to be asked. He heard her fold the blanket, heard her straighten the things on the table, heard her wipe the floor where his blood had trailed in from the door. Everything neat, quiet, precise, the habits of someone who had lived in a space the size of a car seat for 8 months, someone who kept everything orderly because she didn't own enough to make a mess, someone who had learned that if she dropped something, there might not be a second thing to replace it. Vico lay on the sofa in his secret house, listening to a strange girl clean up the disorder of his life, with hands that were used to cleaning up the disorder of her own, and he thought that this was the first time anyone had cared for him without wanting anything from him except money. And even the money, she knew he didn't have right now to pay. By the afternoon of the next day, Vico made his first mistake since waking up. He tried to do everything by himself. He was standing in the kitchen, reaching with his left hand toward the high shelf above the refrigerator for the spare ammunition box he knew he'd hidden there the first time he came to the safe house, because he had gotten the Beretta back after Leah placed it on the kitchen table that morning when he asked. And a gun without bullets was only a piece of iron. He reached too high, his intercostal muscles pulled tight, and he felt it before he heard it, a small pop in his left side, then pain flared sharp and hot, then a warm wetness spread beneath the bandage. He lowered his arm and looked down. Blood had already soaked through the bandage, through his shirt, a dark red stain spreading across the black fabric. The stitches had torn. He cursed under his breath, took the roll of gauze from the first aid kit still open on the table, and tried to wrap it with one hand because his right hand was still swollen and almost useless. The gauze slipped, not tight enough. He caught one end between his teeth and pulled with his left hand, but the angle was wrong. and the loose bandage slid free the moment he let go with his mouth. The second time, the third time. Each attempt got worse, because blood kept the gauze from sticking and made his fingers slick. He was trying for the fourth time when Leah walked into the kitchen. She didn't ask if he was all right, didn't ask what happened. She only looked at the blood on his shirt, looked at the tangled roll of gauze in his hand, then turned and went to get the full first aid kit from the bathroom. She came back, set the box on the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and said, "Take off your shirt." Vico looked at her. "I can do it myself." "You just ripped your stitches because you did it yourself. Take off the shirt, or I'll cut another one open." Her voice wasn't gentle and it wasn't hard, only practical. The voice of someone who had said this sentence, or something like it, to plenty of stubborn people before him, and didn't have time to argue. Vico wanted to refuse. The instinct for control in him hated letting anyone, especially someone he didn't fully know, get close to his body when he was weak. But blood was still seeping out, and he knew if it wasn't stitched again within a few minutes, the wound would swell until stitching it would be almost impossible. He pulled the shirt over his head with his left hand, awkward because he could only use one hand, then sat down in the kitchen chair. Leah dragged a chair over and sat facing his left side. Close, closer than he had allowed anyone to sit in 10 years except Gino. He felt her breath brush his skin as she bent to examine the torn stitches, faintly warm, steady, smelling of hot water and the cheap soap from the bathroom. She opened the first aid kit, drew out the needle and thread, disinfected the wound with alcohol from the small bottle in the kit, then began stitching without counting, without warning him, without saying, "This might hurt." The needle pierced skin, the thread pulled through, tied off, cut, then repeated. Her hands were small, her fingers cold when they touched his skin, but so steady that Vico realized she had done this many times. Not on him, but before him. Somewhere, with someone, these hands had learned how to mend things that had been torn open. Vico didn't look at the stitches. He didn't need to. He had been stitched up enough times to know the feeling. And instead, he looked at her. At this distance, close enough for him to see the tiny loose hairs along her forehead, he saw things he hadn't noticed from across the room. The bruise along her jaw had turned yellow and green. The kind of bruise at least a week and a half old. Not from a fall, but from being hit, because the place and shape of it matched a fist or the back of a hand. A small scar on her forehead, old, already white, probably from years ago. Her ears were pierced, but she wore nothing in them, and he knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent his life among people who didn't have enough, that she had sold them. "Who hit you?" Vico said it lower than he meant to, and his voice carried something he couldn't control. Not anger at her, but anger for her. The kind of anger he hadn't felt for anyone but Gino in years. Leah's hand stopped for 1 second, the needle halfway through. Then she kept stitching, eyes down on the wound. "A drunk customer in a parking lot last week. He saw me sleeping in my car, banged on the door. I didn't open it, so he punched the window and reached in when the glass broke. I handled it." She said, "I handled it," in a flat voice, offering no more explanation. And Vico didn't ask, because he understood that handled for this girl meant she had survived and the man had gone away, and she didn't need anyone pitying her for that. She cut the final stitch, placed a fresh bandage over it, and pressed hard with her palm. And at that exact moment, her hand slipped slightly upward, her fingers touching his chest just below the collarbone as she sealed the edge of the bandage, and she pulled her hand back fast, as if his skin had burned her. Both of them went silent. 1 second, 2 seconds. Neither mentioned it. Leah looked down, but not at the new stitches. She was looking at the other scars, the map of violence carved across his body, now close enough for her to see every line clearly. She pointed at the long scar slanting across his left chest, not touching it, only pointing. Knife. Her finger moved to his right shoulder, to the round sunken mark. Bullet. Old. Then she looked down at his left arm, at the inside of his elbow, where the small round burn marks lay in a neat row. She stayed quiet a little longer as she looked at those marks, and when she spoke, her voice was softer. Not soft because it was weak, but soft because she was weighing whether she should say it at all. "Someone put cigarettes out on your arm." More than once. Deliberately. Vico looked down at his own arm, at the round burns he had seen thousands of times in the mirror but had never heard anyone else say out loud. And he said, "My father." 2 words. He didn't know why he said them. He had never said this to anyone. Not to Gino, not to Tommy when Tommy had still been his brother, not to anyone in the 22 years since the last time his father pressed a cigarette into his skin when he was 14. But he said it to the delivery girl sitting less than a handspan away from him in the kitchen of the safe house in the late afternoon, and he didn't know why. Maybe because she didn't look at him with pity. She didn't gasp in horror. She didn't say, "Oh my God, I'm sorry." She simply looked at him with gray eyes that had seen enough terrible things in life not to be shocked by one more. Leah looked at the burns on his arm, then looked up at his face, and said in a calm voice, though somewhere deep beneath that calm, there was a thin crack. "My father was bad too, in a different way, but the result was the same." On the second night in the safe house, Vico didn't sleep. He sat on the sofa in the dark living room. No lights on because darkness was more familiar than light. The bottle of Macallan wedged between his thighs, his left hand pouring a small swallow into a glass before lifting it to his mouth, his right hand resting on his lap, swollen, useless, the fingers stiff as wood. He drank slowly, not to get drunk, but to push the pain in his side far enough away that he could think. And he thought about Tommy Corrado, 34 years old, the man he had raised from errand boy to right hand, the man who sat beside him in every meeting, who knew every password, every route, every name in the books. Tommy had eaten at his table every Sunday night for 5 years, drunk his liquor, laughed with him, called him brother, in a voice Vico, the man who trusted no one, had believed. And Tommy had sold it all to Benedetti. Not for money, or not only for money, but for something deeper, something Vico hadn't seen. And now, sitting in the dark, he tried to put it back together. But there weren't enough pieces. The accounts were frozen because Tommy knew the codes. The penthouse in the Gold Coast was now Tommy's because the paperwork was under a company Tommy co-managed. The restaurants, the nightclubs, the laundries, all the legal fronts that hid the underground empire, were now in the hands of the man to whom he had once handed the keys to his home. Loyal men had been bought or killed, and he didn't know who was still standing or who was gone because he had no way to make contact. He, Vico Valenti, the man who 12 months ago could walk into any restaurant in Chicago and have the owner stand up to give him a table, was now sitting in a fake abandoned house, drinking whiskey alone in the dark with fresh stitches in his side, sewn by a homeless delivery girl with a needle from a first aid kit. He lifted the glass and took another sip, and the whiskey tasted more bitter than usual. Or maybe it had always been that bitter, and he was only just realizing it. A faint sound from the kitchen pulled him out of his thoughts. Leah was in there. He heard a cabinet door open, heard her searching for something, heard a box being set down on the counter. He didn't get up, didn't go check, because after nearly 2 days of sharing this small space with her, he had begun to recognize the rhythm of her movements, light, purposeful, never wasting a step. And the sound from the kitchen now was the sound of cooking, not snooping. He sat still and listened, oil falling into a pan, a small sizzle. Then the smell of garlic frying began to drift from the kitchen into the living room. Faint, warm, and it touched some place in his chest he hadn't prepared for. Then came the scent of tomato sauce. Lightly tart, gently sweet. So familiar that his hand stopped halfway to his mouth with the glass. He knew that jar of sauce. He had bought it 3 years ago, the first day he came to this safe house, at a small grocery near Riverside. He had stood in the aisle of canned tomato sauces, looking at dozens of labels, and his hand had reached on its own for the jar with the same brand his mother used to buy, the red label with the white border and slanted lettering, the kind of sauce his mother bought every week at the Italian shop on Taylor Street when he was little. He had brought it back, put it in the kitchen cabinet, and never opened it. For 3 years it had sat there, behind the box of pasta and the cans of beans, and he knew it was there every time he opened the cabinet, but he never touched it, because opening that jar of sauce meant smelling his mother's kitchen, and smelling his mother's kitchen meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling, and Vico Valenti had spent many years learning how not to feel. Leah stepped out of the kitchen with a white plate. She had wiped the rim clean, a small detail he noticed because no one in his life, not a restaurant chef, not a server, had ever wiped the rim of a plate before setting it in front of him. She placed the plate on the small table beside the sofa, with the only fork she had found in the drawer, pasta with tomato garlic sauce. So simple it was almost rough. A thin sheen of olive oil covered the surface of the sauce, with tiny golden flecks of fried garlic. "Eat. You haven't eaten all day." She said it, then turned back toward the kitchen, not sitting beside him, not waiting for him to thank her, as if cooking for someone wasn't a big thing, as if she did this every day. But she didn't do this every day. She ate crackers in her car, and half a can of beans split into 2 meals. She had cooked this plate of pasta from the ingredients in his kitchen. For him, because he wasn't eating. And she didn't explain why. As Vico took the first bite, the familiar warmth of the sauce hit him, and the armor he had worn for decades completely shattered. He didn't make a sound. The tears just fell in silence, and Leah stood by, understanding exactly what it meant. After the plate was clean, after Vico set the fork down on the table with a trembling hand, after he sat still for a very long time in the dark living room with red eyes and a jaw clenched so tightly the muscle at his temple twitched, he stood up, carried the empty plate into the kitchen. Leah was standing by the sink, her back to him. He set the plate on the counter beside her, and he spoke in a voice he didn't recognize as his own, because it broke on the final word in a way his voice hadn't broken since he was 14. My mother cooked like this. Leah didn't turn right away. She stood still for 1 second, then turned, looked at him, and said softly, I know. I saw her picture in the drawer. The silence between them was heavy as water. Then Vico spoke, and he didn't look at her while he said it, but down at the empty tomato sauce jar on the counter. She was killed. A drive-by shooting meant for my father. She was standing in front of the house, calling me in for dinner. I was 14. He stopped, swallowed. They were aiming for my father, but the bullets hit her. 3 of them. She fell on the front steps, and I ran out, and I held her, and her blood was warm on my hands, and she looked at me, and she couldn't say anything anymore. He had never told this to anyone. Never. Not because he had forgotten, but because he remembered too clearly, every detail carved into his mind with acid, and speaking it meant living it again, and living it again meant feeling. And as he had already said, Vico Valenti had spent many years learning how not to feel. Leah didn't say, I'm sorry. She didn't step forward to hug him, didn't touch his hand, didn't make any comforting gesture a normal person might make, because she understood that for someone like him, comfort from a stranger was an insult. She only stood there, half a meter away from him in the dark kitchen, and said, I was 19 when I lost my father. He drank himself to death, slowly, every day, right in front of me, and I couldn't do anything. Not because I didn't try, but because you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. The 2 of them stood in the dark kitchen, between the empty plate and the whiskey bottle and the empty tomato sauce jar, and Vico Valenti looked at the homeless delivery girl wearing his shirt, standing on the cold tile floor, and for the first time, he realized that she hadn't only stitched the wound in his skin. On the morning of the 3rd day, Vico heard the knock at the door, before he even realized he had slept. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks. His eyes opened at once, his body going rigid on the sofa, his left hand reaching for the Beretta now tucked beneath the pillow. But he didn't need to draw it, because he knew that rhythm. It had been created 15 years ago. Only 2 people in the world knew it, and one of those 2 people was lying on this sofa. He stood up, slowly because his side still hurt, though less than yesterday. Walked to the door, and opened it. Gino Ferrara stood on the front steps in the morning snow wind, 67 years old, and looking 75. He had been old before Vico ever met him, but this morning he looked as if the past 2 days had taken another 10 years from him. He limped worse than usual, his left leg dragging through the snow, his left arm hanging in a dark scarf tied hastily around his neck as a sling, and beneath his coat, his left shoulder was bandaged with what looked like cloth torn from a shirt. His face was gray, not gray from the cold, but gray from blood loss, from pain, from 2 days without sleep, from walking and hitching rides and following back roads to reach the only place he knew was safe, without letting anyone follow him. Vico didn't hug him, didn't ask if he was all right, because neither man communicated that way. He only stepped aside, let Gino come in, then closed the door and locked it. Gino crossed the threshold, his old eyes sweeping the room quickly by habit. The sofa, the blanket, the open first aid kit on the table, the bloodstain almost cleaned from the floor. Then his eyes stopped at the kitchen doorway, where Leah was standing. She had been awake since she heard the knock, standing still in the kitchen, her back straight, gray eyes looking directly at the strange old man who had just entered the house. She was wearing Vico's white shirt because her own clothes still weren't completely dry after she had washed them by hand in the sink yesterday, and she stood in the kitchen of the mafia boss's secret house with the look of someone who belonged there. Not because she was confident, but because she was used to being in places where she didn't belong. Gino looked at her, looked at the shirt, looked at her bare feet, looked back at Vico. He didn't blink. He didn't ask. He only said in a hoarse, exhausted voice, "I'm not going to ask. Where's the coffee?" Leah turned into the kitchen, and 1 minute later came back with a cup of hot water because there was still no coffee in this house, and Gino took the plain glass of water with his right hand, staring at the clear liquid for a second before taking a slow drink, then sat down heavily in a kitchen chair like a man who had carried the whole city on his shoulders for 2 days, and he began to talk. Tommy had taken everything, not gradually, but overnight, because everything had been arranged before Vico even understood what was happening. The middle-ranking men, the ones Vico had believed were loyal, had either been bought by Tommy months earlier with Benedetti money, or killed on the night of the ambush, or had disappeared because they were smart enough to see which side had won and chose that side. The secret accounts at 3 different banks, the accounts Vico had kept for days like this, were all frozen because Tommy knew the access codes, because Vico had given Tommy those codes 5 years ago, when Tommy had still been his brother, when trust had still been something Vico thought he could use. The penthouse in the Gold Coast, the restaurant on Taylor Street, 2 nightclubs in the West Loop, the laundry in Bridgeport, all of it was now under Tommy's control. The Benedetti family from the East was backing him, providing men, guns, and money, in exchange for Tommy handing them the entire southern route that Vico had controlled for a decade. "I managed to reach Polly before cutting ties," Gino added, his voice dropping. "He's the only one left who didn't buy into Tommy's lies. I told him to trace my steps and bring weapons. He arrived late last night, slipping through the woods undetected." Vico sat listening, his face unchanged, but every detail Gino gave was another knife into something he had thought had already died after Tommy's betrayal, only to discover it was still alive enough to hurt. When Gino finished listing the losses, he fell silent for a while, took another sip of hot water, then said the part they both knew mattered most. "He's looking for the black notebook. He knows it exists, knows you keep it somewhere outside the penthouse, but he doesn't know exactly where. He's turning over every house, every safe, every hiding place he knows about. If he gets that notebook, he controls every relationship, every account, every secret. Not just yours, but those of a dozen people across the city." Vico knew where the notebook was. It was in the nightstand drawer upstairs, less than 10 meters from where he sat, in the same drawer as the second gun and his mother's photograph. And the delivery girl had opened that drawer. Vico turned to Leah. She stood in the corner of the kitchen, her back against the counter, both hands around her cup of water, silently listening to the entire conversation between him and Gino with an expression that didn't change. Not frightened, not overly curious, only awake. "You said you didn't open the notebook," Vico said, his voice flat and cold again, no longer the voice that had broken in the kitchen the night before. Leah looked at him, then she said, "I said I'm not stupid. I didn't say I didn't look." Gino looked at her, then at Vico, his brow tightening. Leah set her own cup down on the counter and spoke plainly, her voice neither apologetic nor defiant. "I opened it. I skimmed it. It was all codes, symbols, initials. I didn't understand what it meant, but I remember." She paused for 1 second. "I have a good memory. 2 years of nursing school. I had to memorize drug names, dosages, interactions, hundreds of things every week. My mind is used to storing data. I remember the numbers in that notebook. Not all of them, but a lot." The kitchen went silent. Gino set his cup down very slowly, his eyes fixed on the thin girl in the oversized shirt standing in the corner of the safe house kitchen, who had just admitted that she had memorized the contents of a notebook holding enough secrets to get a dozen people killed. Vico looked at her, and his voice dropped lower, colder, the voice that, for the past 10 years, made people understand that the next sentence would decide whether they left the room through the door or in a body bag. "You've just made yourself a target." Leah didn't step back, didn't look away from him. She said, "I made myself a target the moment I dragged you into the back seat of my car, instead of taking the $3,000 and driving away." After Leah said that, the kitchen stayed silent long enough for all 3 of them to hear the wind whistling through the gap in the bathroom window she had broken into 2 nights earlier. Gino looked at Vico. Vico looked at Leah, and Leah looked straight back at Vico with unblinking gray eyes. And that silence was a wordless negotiation all three of them understood. She knew too much to leave safely. He needed her to stay more than he wanted to admit. And now the question was no longer whether to trust her, but how to use her. Vico stood, went upstairs, took the black leather notebook from the nightstand drawer, brought it down, and set it on the kitchen table between the three of them. He opened the notebook, turned the pages one by one, and began explaining it to Gino, not to Leah. But she stood there listening, and he didn't send her away because that no longer meant anything. The notebook contained records of 10 years of his underground dealings, but more important than his own records were the records of other people, because Vico didn't only write down what he did, he wrote down what his partners did too. Insurance in ink and paper, the way his father had taught him when he was still a boy, that people betray, but evidence does not. Inside the notebook were detailed records of 3 large money transfers from the Benedetti family to an offshore account Vico knew belonged to a federal congressman in Illinois. Money exchanged for the congressman, blocking an anti-money laundering bill in committee 2 years earlier. It was the thing the FBI had been hunting for 2 years without finding proof, and it was sitting inside a small black leather notebook on his kitchen table. Vico's plan was simple in theory, and almost impossible in reality. Give the notebook to Walt Henley, the most corrupt but practical lawyer in Little Italy, the man who had handled dirty paperwork for half of Chicago's underworld for 20 years. Walt was loyal to no one, but Walt understood the value of information, and if Vico put the notebook in Walt's hands with the right instructions, Walt could use it to create legal leverage that would force Tommy and Benedetti into a corner, because if the information in the notebook leaked to the FBI, not only Benedetti but also the congressman would fall, and Tommy, the man currently protected by Benedetti, would lose his only shield. But the problem was that Vico couldn't go outside. His face, his name, his walk, all of it now existed inside Tommy's system. Every security camera in the city was the enemy's eye. Every person on the street could be an ear. The same was true for Gino, the limping old man with a shoulder wound still not healed, his face familiar to every soldier in the old organization. The moment he stepped onto the street, he stepped into the line of fire. Vico was talking to Gino about contacting Polly, so Polly could carry the notebook when Leah spoke, her voice calm, as if she were discussing a DoorDash delivery. "I'm nobody." Both Vico and Gino turned to look at her. She stood straight, arms not crossed, eyes fixed on Vico. "I'm not in any system. No police record, no bank debt, no credit card, no fixed address, no social media. I deliver food using a DoorDash account tied to a prepaid SIM card bought with cash. No one looks for me because no one knows I exist." Vico looked at her. "You're insane. I dragged a mafia boss into a Honda Civic and stitched up a bullet wound with a needle from a first aid kit. Insane is my baseline." Gino made a coughing sound that might have been laughter or might have been shoulder pain. It was hard to tell. Vico didn't laugh. He looked at her and calculated. Fast, cold, the way he had calculated every decision for the past 10 years. She was right. She was invisible. No one in Tommy's world knew she existed. No one could connect her to him. She was just a thin girl in an old hoodie, someone people looked through on the street as if she were air. That was a superpower no amount of money could buy. The power of invisibility, because society had decided she wasn't worth seeing. "If I do this," Leah said, and she said if, but her eyes said when, "then I want $63,000. The number was so specific that Vico frowned. Not 50,000, not 70,000, but 63. Leah went on without waiting for him to ask. "The remaining tuition for a Bachelor of Science in Nursing at University of Illinois, Chicago. 2 years, $38,400. Books and supplies. About $4,200. Living expenses for 20 months. A studio, food, transportation. $20,400. Total. $63,000. She had calculated that number a long time ago. Vico looked into her eyes and saw it. She hadn't invented that number on the spot. She had carried it in her head for months, maybe years, counting and recounting it every night in her car before sleep, line by line, item by item, the exact amount she needed to turn her life into something different from what it was. And she didn't ask for 63,001. She didn't ask for extra money, just in case. Didn't ask for extra money to make up for the risk. Exactly 63,000, not 1 cent more, because she had lived long enough counting every dollar to know that asking for more than she needed was weakness, and she wasn't weak. "Done," Vico said. One word. Gino looked at him but didn't object, because the old man had lived beside the Valenti family long enough to know when the boss had made up his mind and when it was better to stay silent. Leah nodded, set her cup of water down, went upstairs to change back into her own clothes, which had dried over the heater, the old hoodie, faded jeans, Goodwill jacket. She came down the stairs, and Vico stood waiting at the foot of them with the black leather notebook in his hand. But he didn't hand it over right away. His left hand rose to his right wrist, where the Patek Philippe watch sat, the crystal slightly scratched, the leather band darkened by time, the second hand still moving steadily. His mother had bought that watch for his father on their wedding day, in 1992, before Vico was born, before his father became a monster, before everything broke. After his mother died, Vico took the watch from his father's nightstand drawer, not because it had belonged to his father, but because every morning his mother had fastened that watch around his father's wrist before he left the house, and her fingers had touched this crystal thousands of times, and it was the closest thing Vico still had to touching his mother's hand. His hand shook as he unfastened the strap, and he hated that shaking because it betrayed everything he had built to hide the soft part inside him. But his hand shook, and he couldn't hide it. He placed the watch in Leah's palm. Her hand was small, cold, calloused at the fingertips from steering wheels and delivery bags in Chicago winter. The watch lay in her palm like it was resting in a bird's nest. "If Walt doesn't believe you came from me," Vico said, his voice under control now, flat again, "give him this. He knows this watch. Everyone in the business knows it." Leah looked down at the watch. She didn't look at it like a thing worth money, though she knew it was worth tens of thousands of dollars. She looked at it the way she had looked at the photograph of the woman with flour on her hands hidden in the drawer, because she understood that the two things belonged to the same person, and that the man standing in front of her had just placed the last thing he had left of his mother into her hand. "I'll get it back for you," she said. It was the first promise she had ever made to him, and she said it not in the voice of someone making a promise, but in the voice of someone stating a fact, the voice of a person used to keeping her word because she didn't have enough in life to waste anything, including words. She slipped the watch into the inner pocket of her jacket, took the black leather notebook, stepped out into the snow wind, and drove the rusted Honda Civic away from the dirt road toward the city without looking back. Leah drove the Civic through Chicago in the gray afternoon, the snow falling more lightly than the day before, but the wind still cutting into her skin, and she had to wipe the windshield with her sleeve every few minutes, because the right wiper had been broken for a long time. Little Italy wasn't far from the safe house, but she took the long way around according to Vico's instructions, avoiding main roads, avoiding cameras, avoiding the intersections he had marked on the piece of paper before she left. The black leather notebook sat in the left pocket of her jacket, the Patek Philippe watch in the right, and she felt the weight of both things pressing against her chest every time she breathed, one side holding evidence that could get people killed, the other holding the last memory one man had of his mother. The Italian restaurant Vico had pointed her toward sat on a narrow street at the edge of Little Italy, its sign taken down, the glass door covered with newspaper, closed for at least 1 year if the dust on the windowsill meant anything. She went around back as instructed, down a narrow concrete staircase leading to a basement door, and knocked 3 times. The door opened. Walt Henley stood in the doorway, and Leah's first impression was sweat. This man was sweating even though the basement was cold, sweat beading on his forehead, on his neck, soaking into the collar of his vest, where an old mustard stain sat as if no one had ever bothered to wipe it away. He was fat, not sturdy fat, but wet fat, the kind that came from sitting too much and drinking too much. His small, shifty eyes swept over her from head to toe in less than 1 second, and Leah knew exactly what he saw. A thin girl, old hoodie, faded jeans, sneakers worn thin at the soles. No one worth getting out of a chair for. "Who sent you here?" Walt asked, his voice sweet and greasy as oil. "Vico Valenti," Leah said, and placed the black leather notebook on the desk in the middle of the room, a desk piled with papers and empty liquor bottles. Walt looked at the notebook, then at her, then laughed. The laugh was fat and damp. "Little girl, Vico Valenti is dying or already dead. Half the city is looking for his body. And you walk in here dressed like you just slept under a bridge and tell me he sent you?" Leah didn't laugh back. She looked straight into his eyes, reached into her right pocket, pulled out the Patek Philippe, and set it on the table beside the notebook. The slightly scratched crystal flashed beneath the basement's fluorescent light. Walt stopped laughing. His hand reached for the watch before his mouth managed another word, turning it over, checking the serial number, studying the crystal. And Leah saw his eyes change, the contempt disappearing and being replaced by the unmistakable, undisguised light of greed, because Walt Henley knew this watch, knew what it was worth, and knew who it belonged to. "All right," Walt said, setting the watch down, though his fingers still touched the crystal as if he couldn't bear to let go. "What does he want?" Leah explained exactly what Vico had told her to say. Brief, with nothing extra. The notebook contained evidence of transactions between Benedetti and the federal congressman. Walt would use it as leverage to force Tommy into either negotiation or the threat of the FBI, and in return Walt would keep 10% of whatever was recovered from the frozen assets. Walt listened, nodded slowly, then pulled the watch toward himself. "I'll keep this as a handling fee. Security for both sides." "No," Leah said, her hand closing over the watch faster than Walt could react, slipping it back into her pocket. "The watch comes back with me. You get 10%, like I said." Walt narrowed his eyes, the greasy smile returning. "Little girl, do you know who you're talking to? I know I'm holding the notebook Benedetti would pay 3 times as much for if I brought it to them instead of you," Leah said, her voice flat, not threatening, only stating a fact. The voice of someone who had spent 8 months bargaining over every dollar in tips and understood that negotiation wasn't about who shouted louder, but about who needed the deal more. "Do you want the deal or not?" Walt looked at her longer than he had the first time, and this time he wasn't looking at the old hoodie or the worn shoes. He was looking into her eyes, and he saw what many people before him had made the mistake of missing. This girl wasn't bluffing. He stopped smiling. "Deal." Leah stood, left the notebook on the desk, the watch safe in her pocket, and walked to the door. She climbed the concrete stairs back up to ground level, the cold wind hitting her face, and drove the Civic out of the Little Italy alley with the feeling that she had just finished the hardest part. She was wrong, because she didn't know that the moment she crossed through the basement door, Walt Henley picked up the landline, dialed a number he knew by heart, and when the other end answered, he said, "Tommy, I have what you're looking for, and I know where the girl's going to run back to, because in Chicago, loyalty had a price, and Tommy Corrado always paid more." On the 4th night, the rusted Civic had barely rattled to a stop outside before Leah burst through the front door, freezing air rolling in behind her. She stood in the hallway, catching her breath, her eyes locked onto Vico, with a tense, unreadable gaze, having not yet spoken a single word about Walt or the secret call she had made to the FBI just hours prior. Before Vico could even demand an update, Gino's voice cut through the heavy silence from upstairs, low and urgent with immediate danger. The old man was staring at the small monitor connected to the hidden security camera on the oak tree at the head of the dirt road, a defense mechanism kept secret from everyone. 2 black SUVs were moving slowly along the dirt road, headlights off, only the dim glow of the fog lights showing at the front, less than 2 minutes from the safe house. Vico changed in less than 1 second. Every soft thing Leah had seen in him over the past 4 days, the broken voice when he spoke about his mother, the tears over the plate of pasta, the trembling hand when he gave her the watch, all of it vanished as if it had never existed, and the man standing before her now was the Vico Valenti half of Chicago knew and feared, cold, calculating, his eyes sweeping the room to assess everything that could be used as a weapon or a shield. He gave short orders. Gino and Polly would hold the downstairs, one on each side of the front door. Polly had arrived yesterday afternoon, and the 2 guns were now 4. Leah was to go down to the basement, lock the door, and not come out until he called for her. He said the last sentence while looking straight at her, and she saw in his eyes what he didn't say out loud, that the basement was the safest place in the house, and he was pushing her there for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics. Leah walked toward the basement door, opened it, looked at the stairs leading down into darkness, then looked back at Vico. He was checking the Beretta with his left hand, his right still swollen and almost useless, and when he lifted his arm to slide bullets into the magazine, his shirt pulled up, and she saw that the bandage on his left side had soaked red, the stitches bleeding again because he had moved too hard. He was going to fight with one hand, a bleeding side, against at least 2 vehicles full of men. She didn't go down to the basement. She closed the door, turned, leaned her back against the wall near the stairs, and stayed. Vico looked at her, jaw clenched, but there was no time to argue, because the sound of vehicles had stopped in front of the house. Car doors opened. Footsteps crossed the snow. Then came a knock on the front door. Not the coded knock, but a polite one. 3 even taps. The kind of knock a neighbor used when asking to borrow salt. Vico signaled Gino and Polly to hold position, then opened the door with his left hand, his right keeping the Beretta behind his back. Tommy Corrado stood on the front steps, dressed in a flawless dark gray suit without a single wrinkle, a white shirt beneath it. No coat despite the weather being 5 degrees below zero, as if the cold didn't dare touch him. Behind Tommy, 4 men stood beside the 2 SUVs, hands in their coat pockets, and Vico knew those pockets didn't hold empty hands. Tommy smiled, a wide, warm smile, the smile Vico had believed for years. "You look terrible, Vico," Tommy said, and stepped into the house as if it were his own, not waiting to be invited, not bothered by Gino standing to the right of the door with his gun ready. Tommy hadn't come to shoot. If he had wanted shooting, the 4 men outside would already have stormed in. Tommy had come to talk, and in their world, words were sometimes more dangerous than bullets. "Where's the notebook, Vico?" Tommy asked, standing in the middle of the living room, hands in his trouser pockets, so calm that Vico wanted to punch him in the face for that calm alone. "Why?" Vico asked back. And he wasn't asking about the notebook. He was asking about everything. About 10 years. About every Sunday dinner. About every time Tommy had called him brother. Tommy stopped smiling. And for the first time in 4 days, Vico saw something real behind Tommy's mask. Not hatred. Old pain. Festering for years. "Your father killed my father, Vico. Did you know that? Or were you kept in the dark the way I was?" Vico said nothing. Tommy continued, his voice still even, though his eyes were no longer smiling. "Your father killed my father because he wanted control of the eastern route. Then he killed my uncle because my uncle knew too much. Then he took me into the house, fed me, educated me, let me sit at the same table with his son, because keeping the enemy closer than friends was cheaper than killing more people. I was never your Brinchanner. I was a trophy." Vico stood still, and the pain in his side wasn't 1/10 of the pain from the words Tommy had just spoken, not because he didn't believe them, but because he did, because his father was exactly the kind of man who could have done that. A man who had pressed cigarettes into his own son's arm could absolutely have killed another man's father, and then raised that man's child like a pet. Then Tommy's eyes stopped behind Vico, where Leah stood against the wall beside the basement door. Tommy narrowed his eyes, then smiled again. "Walt told me about the delivery girl, so here she is." Tommy lifted a hand to signal the men outside, his voice light, as if he were asking a server to bring more wine. "Take her outside." Vico moved before he had time to think. He didn't calculate, didn't weigh, didn't assess tactics. He stepped left and stood between Leah and Tommy, his broad shoulders blocking her completely from view, his left hand raising the Beretta straight at Tommy, and he spoke in a voice so low Leah, standing behind him, could barely hear it. "She has nothing to do with this. Get out of my house." Tommy looked at the gun, looked at Vico, looked at the left arm holding the weapon, trembling slightly because his wounded body didn't have the strength to keep it steady, and then Tommy spoke, every word dropping into the room like stones into a well. "Your house? You don't have a house anymore, Vico." But Tommy was wrong about one thing. He thought the girl standing behind Vico was only the delivery girl Walt had described, a nameless little errand runner for a desperate boss. He didn't know that while Leah sat in the Civic driving back from Little Italy that afternoon, she hadn't only been thinking about Walt or the notebook. She had been thinking about the numbers. 2 years of cramming drug names, dosages, and diagnostic codes in nursing school had turned her mind into the kind of mind that couldn't look at a string of numbers without automatically searching for patterns, and the numbers she had skimmed in the black notebook on the first night were now arranging themselves in her head like puzzle pieces, finding one another. 3 transaction codes, 3 specific dates, 1 repeated set of initials, and 1 account number she remembered because it ended with the same 4 digits as her father's birthday. A meaningless coincidence, but enough for her brain to lock onto it and refuse to forget. When she returned to the safe house and told Vico about Walt, she didn't tell him this part because she wasn't yet sure what it meant. But when Gino sat listening and mentioned the federal congressman and the FBI, every piece in her head fell into place. 3 money transfers, 3 dates, 1 offshore account, 1 congressman. She knew what she was carrying in her head, and she knew who would want to hear it. she didn't tell Vico. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she knew that if she told him, he would stop her. Because he would want to control the situation. Because that was his instinct. And his instinct right now would get them both killed. Instead, while Vico and Gino discussed the next plan downstairs, she went upstairs and took the backup phone Gino had given her before the trip to Walt, an old flip phone with a prepaid SIM card that Gino kept for emergencies. She found the FBI tip line number. It wasn't hard. It was public online. Anyone could call. And most calls to that line were trash, crazy people, neighbors reporting one another out of personal grudges. But Leah didn't call to accuse anyone. She called and read out the 3 transaction codes, the 3 dates, the account number, and the initials she remembered. Then she said, "These payments are linked to a federal congressman in Illinois. I believe this is what you've been looking for, and the person holding the original evidence is at this address." She read the safe house address. Then she hung up. She knew she had just burned the last bridge. If the FBI didn't respond, then she had wasted the call. If the FBI did respond, then she had just pulled federal law enforcement into the house of the mafia boss she was staying with, and both she and he could be arrested. But she also knew Tommy would come, because Walt had sold them out. She had felt it in the way Walt looked at her when she left, not with the eyes of a man who had just made a deal, but with the eyes of a man already calculating the next one. And when Tommy came, no Beretta fired by one working hand would save them. The FBI was the only card, and she had played it before Tommy could arrive. Now, standing behind Vico in the living room, hearing Tommy say, "You don't have a house anymore," and hearing footsteps from outside the vehicles moving toward the door, she counted in her head. More than 3 hours had passed since her call. If the FBI had taken the call seriously, if the numbers she read matched the files they already had, then the fastest response from the Chicago FBI office would be roughly 2 to 4 hours. She was at minute 200, and she prayed for the first time in years, not to God, but to mathematics, praying that she had remembered the numbers correctly, and that the federal machine would move faster than usual. Tommy signaled again. 2 men from outside stepped across the threshold, and Vico moved back 1 step, pressing Leah closer to the wall, the Beretta still raised, but his hand was shaking harder now, and she knew he couldn't hold it much longer. Then she heard it. Far away, very far away, but clear in the still winter night of the suburbs. Sirens, not one, but many, the wails overlapping one another, coming closer fast, and then blue and red lights swept across the safe house windows like lightning across the sky, and the thudding of a helicopter trembled over the roof, and a loudspeaker voice shouted through the snow wind, ordering everyone to drop their weapons and get on the ground. Tommy froze. The smile went out. The 4 men outside the vehicles looked at one another, then at the forest of blue and red lights rushing in from 3 directions along the dirt road, and they knew, through pure survival instinct, that shooting at the federal FBI was completely different from shooting at a rival mafia crew. Weapons dropped into the snow. Hands went up. Tommy looked at Vico, then at Leah standing behind him, and in the blue and red light sweeping across Tommy's face, she saw him understand. He didn't know how she had done it, but he knew she had. The FBI flooded in, body armor, rifles, flashlights, sweeping every corner. Tommy and his men were forced down to the floor and cuffed. Gino and Polly were disarmed and pushed against the wall. Vico was seated in a chair, one hand cuffed to the chair arm, but the lead agent looked at the bleeding stitches in his side and called for medical help instead of reading him his Miranda rights, because in the report the FBI had received through the tip line, Vico Valenti was an assassination victim and a potential witness, not the target. The black notebook Walt was holding would be seized by the FBI within the next few hours, and the contents inside would prove Tommy Corrado and the Benedetti family guilty of bribing a federal official, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder, not Vico. Vico sat in the chair, cuffed, his side bleeding, looking through the door into the yard where Leah was being led away by 2 agents. She looked small in the old hoodie among people wearing body armor, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, where the Patek Philippe watch still rested safely, and she walked across the snow toward the FBI vehicle, without looking back, without looking at him, without waving, without saying a word. And Vico Valenti, the man who had lost his penthouse, lost his empire, lost every account and every soldier without fear, felt fear for the first time in his life. Fear of losing something he couldn't demand back, with money, couldn't hold with a gun, and couldn't replace with anything else in the world. 3 months after the night the FBI surrounded the safe house, Tommy Corrado was convicted in federal court of bribing an official, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. The Benedetti family collapsed like dominoes. The federal congressman resigned before he could be indicted. The offshore accounts were frozen, and 4 members of the family received sentences ranging from 12 to 25 years in federal prison. Vico Valenti cooperated with the FBI, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. And in return, he lost almost everything. The penthouse in the Gold Coast was seized. The restaurants, the nightclubs, the laundry, all of it was shut down or transferred into federally frozen assets. The territory 3 generations of the Valenti family had built dissolved into legal paperwork and evening news reports. But Vico was free. Conditional freedom, probation, an ankle monitor, weekly meetings with a probation officer, no leaving Illinois, but free. And he kept the safe house, because the wooden house at the end of the dirt road in Riverside had been bought with legal money before the underground empire took shape, personally owned, clean on paper, and the FBI had no reason to seize it. He started over from that house. Not in some grand cinematic way, no speech, no slow-motion moment beneath golden sunlight. He started by fixing the first-floor bathroom window, the window Leah had broken into on the first night, and when he drove new screws into the wooden frame, his right hand was still weak, his little finger permanently crooked, because the hand bone hadn't healed straight, and he had to use both hands to hold the screwdriver steady. Gino suggested opening a restaurant. The 67-year-old man said it in an ordinary voice, as if he were suggesting they make coffee, saying that Riverside needed a decent Italian restaurant, that the old bakery space at the end of the street was renting cheap, and that Polly could cook well enough to serve diners who weren't too demanding. Vico said nothing for a full day after Gino suggested it. Then that night, he sat at the kitchen table in the safe house and wrote a menu on the back of a paper from the first aid kit, and the first dish he wrote down was pasta with tomato garlic sauce. The restaurant opened after 6 weeks, small, 12 tables, Gino managing the front, Polly in the kitchen, and Vico doing everything else, from arranging tables and chairs to washing dishes when they were short-staffed. No one in the neighborhood knew who the owner had once been, and Vico didn't say, and Gino didn't say, and the ankle monitor stayed hidden beneath his pant leg. But through all 6 weeks of opening the restaurant, through every morning he woke in the safe house, and every night he came back, Vico thought about Leah. She disappeared after the night the FBI took her statement. Not disappeared as if someone had hidden her away or threatened her, but disappeared the way a homeless girl disappears, silently, without a trace. Because from the beginning she had never existed in any system. The backup phone from Gino that she had used was taken by the FBI. Her prepaid DoorDash SIM had been canceled long ago. There was no address to send a letter to because she had no address. No social media, no email, nothing. Vico tried to find her the old way, the way he had used for 10 years to find anyone in the city within 24 hours. But the old way required a network, required people, required money, required power, and he didn't have any of those things anymore. Finally, Gino said he'd look for her, and he looked not in the mafia way, but in the most ordinary way in the world. The limping 67-year-old man went to every parking lot where DoorDash drivers gathered in Chicago, asking each person whether they knew a girl named Leah who drove a 2009 Civic, asking on the South Side, in the West Loop, in Hyde Park, in Pilsen, a few parking lots each day, a few people shaking their heads in each lot, for 5 straight weeks. In the 5th week, a driver in a parking lot near UIC said he knew Leah. She wasn't doing DoorDash anymore. She was back in school. Gino brought the news to Vico that evening, sitting at the restaurant's kitchen table after closing, and said, "The girl enrolled in the Bachelor of Science in Nursing program at University of Illinois, Chicago. She starts in January. $63,000. Vico had kept his word. He transferred the money through Gino before the FBI froze his assets, drawing from the $3,000 in his wallet and the rest from the basement safe in the safe house that the FBI never found, and Gino sent it to her through an intermediary account he opened under his real name, because this 67-year-old man had never had a criminal record, and his banking history was as clean as rainwater. Leah accepted the money, didn't call back, didn't text, didn't say thank you, and Vico hadn't expected her to, because he understood that she didn't owe him gratitude. She had traded for it with the stitches in his side and 4 nights without sleep to keep him alive. She rented a small studio near the school, and Gino knew that because the limping old man asked around one more time to make sure. A small studio, 1 bed, 1 study desk, 1 kitchen, and for the first time in 2 years, Leah Sutton had an address of her own, a key of her own, a door that could close without anyone breaking the glass at 3 o'clock in the morning. In the drawer beside her bed, folded neatly, lying still, was the white cotton shirt she had worn for 4 nights in the safe house. She didn't wear it anymore. She just kept it. The March snow was melting on the sidewalk in front of the gates of University of Illinois, Chicago. The last thin snow of the season scattered over the pavement like salt, dissolving into small puddles beneath the weak afternoon sun, and Vico Valenti stood there, about 10 steps from the school gate, among the stream of students passing by without anyone looking at him twice. He wore an ordinary dark coat, no suit, no watch on his wrist, the little finger on his right hand permanently crooked because the bone hadn't healed straight, and if you had passed him on the sidewalk, you would have seen only a tall man with a faint scar on his temple waiting for someone, nothing worth a second look. He had been standing there nearly 40 minutes when she came out through the gate, a backpack on her shoulder, books in her hand, dark brown hair tied high, the quick stride of someone with a full class schedule who didn't want to waste a minute. She looked different. Not different because she was prettier or heavier, but different because for the first time since he had met her, Leah Sutton looked like someone who had a place to go home to. She saw him and froze mid-step, 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, her backpack slipping slightly on her shoulder, gray eyes widening for half a second before she brought her face back under control. She stood still looking at him, and he stood still looking at her, and between them was a river of students passing by, knowing nothing. "How did you find me?" Leah asked, her voice calm, though it rose a little higher than usual on the last word. "I had a limping 67-year-old man ask around every delivery driver parking lot in the city. 5 weeks. Leah almost smiled, almost just the corner of her mouth lifting and then stopping, exactly the way Vico had almost smiled in the safe house kitchen the night she demanded $20,000. "What do you want?" she asked. Vico looked at her. He looked at the backpack on her shoulder, the thick book in her hand, the shoes newer than the worn-down ones she had been wearing that night, and he looked into her eyes, still gray, still alert, still faintly shadowed because she probably still stayed up late studying, but no longer carrying the kind of darkness that came from sleeping in a car. "I opened a restaurant," he said. "A small one, in Riverside." "I know," she said. "Gino told me." Silence. A student on a bicycle rang his bell loudly while cutting between them, but neither of them moved. Vico opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "I don't need someone to cook." He stopped, swallowed. "I need someone to eat with." His voice broke slightly on the final word, the kind of break you wouldn't hear unless you were standing close enough. But Leah was standing close enough, and she heard it, and she understood that the man in front of her, the man who had once controlled half of Chicago's underworld, the man who had killed and been marked for death, who had betrayed and been betrayed, was standing outside the gate of a university and asking her to sit down and eat with him because he didn't want to eat alone anymore. Leah looked at him, the faint scar at his temple, the crooked little finger, the black eyes that weren't completely cold anymore, not quite warm, but different, like the safe house that looked abandoned from the outside while someone inside was trying to repair every door, one by one. "I still have your shirt," she said softly. "Keep it," Vico said. "I bought a new one." Leah held out her hand. Not for him to hold, but for a handshake. Like a deal. Like the first night in the kitchen when she asked for $20,000 and he nodded. Like when she named $63,000 down to the exact dollar. Like the way the two of them had communicated from the beginning. Through deals, through terms, because they were both people who had lived too long without trusting anyone to say, "I want to be with you," or "I want to be with you." So they spoke in the only language they both understood. Vico took her hand. His hand was large, covering her smaller one, and her hand wasn't cold anymore the way it had been the night he placed the watch in her palm. Her hand was warm. "Deal," Leah said. "Deal," Vico said. He gestured toward an ordinary sedan parked curbside, opening the passenger door for her as they left the crowded campus behind, ready to share their first proper table in Riverside. Not a contract of money. It was the simplest promise, and also the hardest one to keep. The promise to sit at the same table and not eat alone anymore. This story isn't only a story about the mafia or about love. It's a story about what happens when two people the world has forgotten. One forgotten because he was too dangerous, and one forgotten because she was too invisible, find each other on the darkest night of both their lives. The lesson this story wants to send you is that sometimes what heals a person isn't money, isn't power, isn't revenge, but simply a meal cooked by the sincere hands of someone who has nothing and yet is willing to give everything. That human dignity doesn't lie in what you own, but in what you choose to do when you have nothing left. Leah Sutton could have taken the $3,000 and walked away, but she chose to stay. Vico Valenti could have kept everything for himself, but he chose to give away the last thing he had of his mother. And both of them, through small choices made in the cold, snowy night of Chicago, saved not only each other's lives, but also each other's humanity. If this story touched your heart, please hit like so it can reach more people. Share it with someone you think needs to hear that kindness still exists in this world, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss new stories every day. We'd love to know how you felt after this story. Have you ever experienced a moment in life when one small act of kindness completely changed the way you saw the world? Please share it in the comments below, because we read every comment, and every one of your stories is precious to us. Thank you for listening until the very last minute. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.